That's the question that we want to ask with regard to sanctions. Is there any way by which a country can be isolated economically, which is responsible for the breach of international peace and security, right? And the answer to that is yes. If this is the question, the answer is yes. The answer is Article 41 of the UN Charter. If a country needs to be isolated from any kind of economic activity because of its acts of aggression to another country, or in any other way it is threatening the international peace and security, then such action can be taken with regard to economic sanctions against that country by the Article 41 of the United Nations Charter. Now, Article 41 of the United Nations Charter falls under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. It is under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. What does Article 41 say? Again, this is going to be relevant for your prelims examination, so please take a note. We are in a way hitting the chapter of sanctions just precisely so that you can have possible questions coming out from this area. Okay, please note this properly. When we take a look at Article 41 of the UN Charter, what Article 41 of the UN Charter says is this, that if the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, passes a resolution under Article 41, if United Nations Security Council passes a resolution under Article 41, please pay attention to this again. If the United Nations Security Council passes a resolution under Article 41, then such a resolution can create an obligation upon all the UN members. Currently there are 193 members at the United Nations 193 member states to the United Nations General Assembly, all UN members, to partially or totally interrupt economic activities with any country named in the resolution as involved in the breach of international peace and security. Please take a look at this very clearly and note it down if possible. We are asking a very simple question. Is there any way to isolate a country that is involved in breach of international peace and security? Right? Which means by isolation, I mean economically isolation. Kind of an economic boycott of that country can happen. Is there any way to economically isolate a country which is involved in the breach of international peace and security? And the answer to that is very simple, that yes, in international law terms, a sanction which a legal basis can be employed. Again, I'll repeat, in international law terms, it is possible to make sanctions against a country which is involved in the breach of international peace and security. But for that, Article 41 of the UN Charter has to be invoked under Chapter 7. Okay, this is the point that I'm trying to emphasize. If the United Nations Security Council passes a resolution under Article 41A, then such a resolution can create an obligation upon all UN members to partially or totally interrupt economic activities with any country named in the resolution as involved in the breach of international peace and security. This is what I'm trying to indicate to you. Okay, so by this we in a way want to take a holistic view as at the concept of economic sanctions. You see what we are doing over here? We're taking an overall view on the concept of economic sanctions and the way in which economic sanctions work are either unilateral or by United Nations. Unilateral economic sanctions which are imposed by one country over the other country without the consent of other countries is a kind of a breach of customary international law, because in a globalized interconnected economic framework it is impossible for one to assume that any economic sanction imposed by one country over the other will not have an impact upon a third country. You see the kind of trade relations that the world has today, the kind of interconnectivity that the world has in a way achieved with itself today, and the so many intricate supply chains which have been created from one part of the world to another part of the world. It cannot be the case that if you touch one country, the effects of the sanctions are going to remain in that country only. It is not going to be the case that if you're going to take a look at or touch one country, the impacts of the sanctions are going to be contained in that country only. You can't do that. It is going to be open for all the countries to have a view upon that matter, because they will also have an impact upon that. They will also feel the impact of that situation. So if a country passes sanctions on another country without taking the assent of other countries around it, then it is obviously going to be problematic because of international law. Then you are just putting your dictate upon the entire world, right? But with United Nations Charter, if you pass a resolution by procedure under Article 41 of the UN Charter, then such an economic sanction which is imposed will not be subjected to infirmity in international law. Then such an economic sanction becomes internationally viable, provided that the United Nations Security Council passes a resolution, which in itself is a big task, because United Nations Security Council has 5 members who barely agree with each other upon anything, and each member has a veto power. Permanent members I'm talking about. And especially Russia in this particular case, country against whom sanctions are being charged itself has a power to discharge the sanctions and veto the resolution. So it is practically impossible to use the powers of Article 41 of the UN Charter. Nonetheless, these powers exist in the broader sense of the word, and these are possibly the most powerful powers given to the United Nations to create a complete economic blockade or isolation of a country with reference to the sanctions, in terms of understanding how these things work out. Class, are we clear about this? Do we understand this now? So this in a way subsumes and completes our chapter upon what we call economic sanctions. Now, how do these two things connect, right? Basically what we are saying is that because of the sanctions imposed by the Russians and the Ukrainians, sorry, by the Americans and the Europeans upon the Russian oil and other Russian commodities, but specifically upon the Russian oil, you see that this entire architecture of the supply chains by which Russia was banking upon creating huge amounts of capital by selling raw oil to the Americans, to the Europeans, that entire route has come to an end, which means a massive oil trade integration has collapsed, which will obviously have a larger geopolitical, repercussion, ramifications, or even advantages for certain countries, right? It's an event that happens in geopolitics, and it can have both positive and negative consequences depending from the perspective that you view it. But this is the major event of the last 2-3 years, that Europe and Russia have in a way been delinked from each other in terms of their oil supply and oil activities. And that's basically what we are mostly interested in understanding as to how does this activity create a process.